Hi everyone, welcome to iNACOL's May Leadership Webinar. My name is Natalie Abel. I'm a Program Manager here at iNACOL, and I'll be helping to facilitate today's webinar. So before we get started today, I know our wonderful presenters have a ton of great content to share with you, but I'd love to just quickly go over a few housekeeping details with you as some more folks continue to trickle in here. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a chat box. And if you haven't done so already, we encourage you to please introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, where you're tuning in from today, anything specific you're hoping to take home from today's webinar, or any specific questions you brought with you today too. And we also encourage you to really share your own insights and expertise in the chat box too, so that we can learn from you as well. And be sure to ask a lot of questions too. It's such a great opportunity for us all to learn together, and we'll be sure to take some time to address your questions during today's webinar as well. So also, if you are a fan of Twitter, we encourage you to share what you're learning there too, and on your other social media channels. We can drop some Twitter handles into the chat box for you, and you can tag our presenters today. You can tag iNACOL so that we can all extend our learning onto social media networks as well. And just so you all are aware, today's webinar will be recorded and archived, so you'll be able to download today's slides and access this full recording as well. So we'll send you all a follow-up email with all of those links and all of that information, so you can refer back to this conversation at any time in the future and share it with your peers as well. So with that, I am so grateful to have David Rose and Mindy Johnson of CAS with us today to explore Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, and accessibility in K-12 education, and how to design learning experiences that serve all students. So I won't take up any more time today. So grateful to have you both, and they're just going to be rock star presenters. So David, I will now turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to give an overview, I'm going to talk for a while about the sort of foundations of UDL. And Mindy will come on to talk about some specific applications and implementations in UDL, and then we'll wrap up together a little bit at the end. And we'll try to save some time for questions. And Mindy is great at monitoring chat rooms, so if people want us to answer questions, please put them in the chat room, and we'll monitor that. And when it seems good, we'll respond. But we like questions. Okay, so that's us. Mindy's the good-looking one. So first, just what's the idea? I know the people have very different backgrounds. We'll begin with just quickly on what the idea of universal design for learning is, and then we'll go a bit more deeply. So I think everybody's aware of the universal design argument, that buildings in the architectural world were designed in such a way that lots of people did not have access, and retrofitting buildings to provide better access often leads to just a different kind of bad design, certainly better, but that they're often ugly and kludgy and don't work very well for people with disabilities, and often get you in the back of the building, and it's not a sense of equity and so on. And most importantly, it's very expensive. This is the ramp added to an older building, and it was a huge amount of money. So the alternative, as everyone's aware, I think, is building it from the beginning with the full range of users in mind, and then you can make it actually beautiful, and it becomes a better access technology for everybody. So in this particular one, the ramps and stairs are embedded together so that people in wheelchairs can use them, but also people in strollers and skateboards and all kinds of things. Baby carriages have a built-in way to access the building, and people who like stairs or can use them have the same several options. So the key thing is that options are built in. There are several ways to do things, and universal design is about those options rather than that there's some perfect single solution. So that's the idea. What is universal design for learning? It's a research-based framework for designing learning technology and classrooms too, and even summer camps increasingly, that are designed for everyone from the start. And there are three main principles, which you can see here in color. Provide multiple means of engagement is one principle. Students are really different in the ways in which they're engaged in learning and in the kinds of activities we do for learning. They're not at all the same. Secondly, provide multiple means of representation, the ways in which we can present information so that students can comprehend it. Need to be there need to be options in that. There's no single representation that works for everybody. And lastly, provide multiple means of action expression. When we ask kids to express what they know, if we ask them to do that in only one way, it ensures that some people will do very well and some people will do very poorly, because we're all very different in the ways in which we most successfully can express what we know and act on. The full UDL guidelines and checkpoints and things look like this, so it's quite complicated, and we're definitely not going to go into anything like the depth that this implies, but I wanted to just show where this comes from a little bit. So you can see the first column's about engagement, and we scoured the literature both from the learning sciences and from curriculum development for what are those aspects of engagement upon which people differ, and that would need to be attended to in providing options. And usually it's best to read these columns from the bottom up, just looking at the green lines here. Those are the guidelines. And so at the bottom of the first column is provide options for recruiting interest. So this is just getting kids' attention. And below that, you'll see there are various things that research evidence shows are important in order to recruit kids' interest. Above that is providing options for sustaining effort and persistence, that most learning activities require not just a quick glance or a quickly recruited attention, but in fact kids sustaining effort and persisting in practice and so on like that. And so there's a different set of research-based things to do when you're interested in sustaining that effort and persistence. And it's everything from building community and collaboration, because that really helps people sustain their interest, giving mastery-oriented feedback. I'm just reading the little checkpoints below that so you can see what it looks like. So I think everyone knows Carol Dweck's work, so that's clearly an important part of UDL. Providing mastery-oriented feedback is a key way to ensure that kids are helped to sustain effort and persistence. And lastly, moving up that column, providing options for self-regulation. And this is to connote that, in fact, we don't want kids who are just good at engaging because we, the teacher, are doing all the work, or the technology is doing all the work to recruit their interest, or that the same kinds of things are built in to sustain effort. What we want is kids in the end who can self-regulate, who can set good goals for themselves, can handle frustration, can cope, and so on, and that they are continually monitoring. Is this working for me? What's motivating to me? Am I setting appropriately challenging goals, and so on? So there's a set of things that evidence talks about where, or shows for how do we provide options to help kids learn to self-regulate rather than to just do what teachers tell them to do. So I won't go down all the columns, but that first one, and you can see what parts of the brain they're highlighted in green. The central parts of the brain are where your brain does the things that we call engagement, as it sets priorities for our attention and effort. The second column is about how we present things to kids, and you can see the back part of the brain is highlighted because that's the back part of the brain is predominantly and almost exclusively where you take information in and perceive it, analyze it, and comprehend it. And the last column is about how do you act on the knowledge you have, how do you express what you know. And so what's highlighted is the front half of the cortex, and that part of the brain is how you organize your acts on the world. And it begins at the bottom with just physically acting. Motor cortex is here, just kids differ in how well they can act physically. Second guideline in this column has to do with how do kids express themselves, and that moves a little bit forward in the cortex, and that is how we speak, write, communicate in a whole wide variety of things that were really quite different. Sometimes I tell dog and pony stories about my inability to dance as a good example of how we're all quite different. I can communicate very effectively in some modes, but I can't effectively, not so effectively when I try to dance. And last, but definitely not least, on the top of this column is the guideline for providing options for executive functions. So that's at the very front of your cortex. And executive functions, I think people are aware of how kids can in fact set appropriate goals, have plans and strategies in place, and managing information and so on, and monitoring their own process. So many kids in school, their primary problems are executive function. Just aren't. Those things are hard. They don't have physical problems. They don't have. They're not blind or have perceptual problems and so on, but they have trouble organizing themselves to get things done. And lots of you are teachers and you know those kids. So those are the three. They're aligned to three major parts of the network that we do everything with, and the evidence comes again from the neuroscience of learning and from the educational research on what works across a variety of students. And the answer is, as you'll see in all of those, that it's providing options, that we're all different, and we're different in these systematic ways. And so it's key to provide options rather than to look for one simple solution. So that's what UDL looks like. It's that framework, 9 guidelines, and lots of little checkpoints with the evidence behind them. So just a quick comment on why caring about universal design for learning is potentially worth it, how important is it, and just some evidence from the world about what's happening in the UDL universe. So I think many of you know that UDL is written into ESSA, and I know very much question about what's going to happen with ESSA, but as it is, UDL is in 7 or so times in various places, so there's a strong push for, at the national level, for paying attention to UDL guidelines and following them. UDL is now appearing in most textbooks on, certainly on anybody dealing with special education, but in many of the more recent books on classroom practice, UDL is now a prominent either chapter or in some cases the whole book's organized around UDL principles. I just returned from the Council for Exceptional Children, their national convention, and there were 35 UDL talks, which seemed to me a lot. So there's a lot of action in those kinds of domains. The U.S. Department of Education's Ed Tech Developers Guide that came out last year has a strong section on UDL saying if you're an Ed Tech developer, you should be following the principles of UDL. And state plans developed under ESSA are encouraged or pushed or whatever to include UDL in their state plans. There are companies now who claim that they are UDL kind of companies. This is one of them, and increasingly technology providers will highlight in a paragraph or two how they think their products follow the UDL guidelines, and sometimes much more strongly than that. UDL used to be a K-12 thing. Now it's very much moved into higher education, and it's moved overseas now. Many countries are adopting UDL, and some have national UDL initiatives now. And Harvard Ed Review just came out with their most recent issue. It's just one example of the researchy kinds of journals, which looks for a cross-pollination between UDL and culturally responsive education. And they've had two issues in a row that looked at that thing. So UDL's in that kind of educational leadership community. And we have a project that's going on now with PBS around how do we make the Ready to Learn, the big $100 million Ready to Learn project. The Department of Ed wanted it to be an exemplar of UDL. So that's kind of the range of where UDL is, and a lot of progress been made lately. So what are the principles and guidelines based on? And so a little bit about the foundations, and there are two. One is advances in the cognitive and affective learning sciences, and the second is advances in the technologies that we can use as teaching and learning instruments. So first, just a few moments on what we're learning from the modern learning sciences. And I think probably people are somewhat familiar, and some of you a lot familiar with, excuse me, the recent descriptions of the brain are primarily about the brain's connectivity. How is it connected? And that turns out to be more important than how many neurons you have or how much glial cells or any of those kinds of things. But what is the connection pattern of your brain, my brain, and so on? And that's called the connectome. It's an analog to the genome. What's at the base of the ways in which you're going to learn? So the connectome is the word people use now. And what we know is that people's connectomes look different. So here's a study that looked at auditory cortex, and it showed two different kinds of connectivity patterns. The one on the bottom is sort of a super highway of connections, big, thick connections between, again, all this is an auditory cortex, but a highly connected auditory cortex, a lot of axons running between neurons in it. The top screen shows a person with a much thinner connections, not that there's damage or anything, but just a different proportion, different amount of connectivity, and those are two different connectomes. And what do they mean? Well, I often tell the story. I'm going to only do it briefly here between my wife and I. So my wife has the kind of brain that's on the right, and they are called sometimes hyper-connected. But she has a lot of connectivity in the auditory cortex. What does that mean? It means she has, in fact, terrific auditory capacities of a number of kinds. She has perfect pitch, for example. That means any note you play, she knows immediately that it's a B+, a B flat. I just turned in my grades, that's why I made that mistake. So an A flat, a C sharp, or whatever, Ruth knows immediately. It's easy for her. It's not like she has to think about it, same way that you recognize red. I am not like that. I have, fair to poor pitch. I'm the kind that has the connectivity pattern there, the very thinly connected auditory cortex. So I have hypo acuity of pitch, and Ruth has this hyper acuity of pitch. And I should say briefly the question of who has a disability here. And the answer is that's context dependent. Disability feels like that most times we look at it. So in Ruth sings semi-professionally, so in the music hall, I am quite disabled. That is, I can't sing in the kinds of choruses Ruth can sing in because my pitch isn't good enough. And my wife is deeply regretful that she married me because I passed on my hypo connectivity to our children, so they don't have good pitch either. And so Ruth feels she has now a whole family of disabled people that she has to live with and sing with. But there are always conditions, including the church that we go to, where nobody actually is that great at pitch, and our church organ is old and it's not playing the exact notes it's supposed to play anymore. So most people in the congregation just sing along with the organ. They don't care. They don't know that it's not really playing a B flat, and they're fine. And I'm in that category, and so we all are happy, and we're not really on pitch, and we don't care. But for my wife, it's traumatizing because nobody in church is on pitch. She doesn't know what to do. She looks at the hymn book. She sees an A flat, but nobody in the whole church is singing A flat, so she mumbles. And in that regard, she looks like the person with a disability. She's not able to adjust to the conditions of our church, and she looks disabled. And a lot of disabilities look like that. They're context dependent. What are the demands of the situation? So in some contexts, like Symphony Hall in Boston, perfect pitch is ideal. In other contexts, like summer camp sing-alongs or our church, relative pitch, hypoacuity is much better. So disability is not something that resides in your head. It resides in the connection between the particular connectome you have and the demands of the task. Well, forgot how to move my slides. Large variability among people. I'm not going to go into this slide, but turns out we're all different in a whole variety of that kind of ways. That was just an example. And one of the more recent and powerful findings is that when we look at kids on the spectrum, kids are on the spectrum from hyperconnectivity of the kind that Ruth has in auditory cortex to hypoconnectivity, less connectivity. And we call the ones that are hyperconnected children with autism. They have exquisitely good perceptual capacities. In fact, the incidence of perfect pitch is very high in children with autism because they have that kind of brain, and they have brains that are really good at a lot of things and really good at memory, for example, of certain kinds. But they also, that hyperconnectivity is bad for some things, just like I talked about with music. Typically, developing children are kind of mid-range. They have, not anywhere near the level of connectivity of children with autism, and that makes them poor at some things. They don't have much perfect pitch, for example, and very good at some others. They're good at generalizing. They can understand metaphors and similes more easily because they're not too careful. They don't have sharp perceptual abilities and constraints. So people are really different, and we used to think of children with autism as having, some kind of damage, some kind of hole in their head. But this view that they're just a different kind of connectome makes us then look at what are the things they're going to be good at and what are the things they're not good at. And unfortunately in our schools, we've tended to kind of have only one way to present information, only one way that kids can express themselves. So kids with autism are left out of that, and they look disabled rather broadly, when in fact it's not a good way to think of them. And that's probably enough of that. Am I clicking the right ones here? Okay, and similarly, reading spectrum is everything's on a spectrum. I'm just arguing here that we're not just disabled and not disabled, but there are kids who I have dyslexia here, sort of at one side of the spectrum. But alexia is kids that have much worse difficulties with reading than kids with dyslexia. So they're at one extreme. At the other extreme are kids with hyperlexia that are incredibly stronger than most of us, myself included. They learn to decode early in life, before schooling typically, and they're perfect at it, perfect spellers, and so on. They have hyperlexia, and many children with Asperger's, for example, can be hyperlexic, early decoders. But the main point is here that reading is not one thing. So you can be hyperlexic, meaning really good decoder. You can really pick up the patterns of English orthography. But that kind of brain is not so good at comprehension or understanding poetry or things like that. Whereas at the other end, dyslexia or alexia, you can have people that have real trouble decoding but have good comprehension if you do it in another mode, like speaking or a film or something like that. Okay, so we're all on spectra. I like to say I'm on the spectrum and so are you. So learning sciences help us identify what are the barriers, the kinds of barriers that come from being on all of the kinds of spectra that we have. And I've here symbolized it by, what are the barriers to getting to Shakespeare? If we want kids to learn Shakespeare, what kind of positions on these spectra, their connectomes, make that difficult? And one of them is, just as I said, people with dyslexia, alexias, have trouble getting to Shakespeare if we use the technology on the left. If we use books where they have to decode, then their comprehension of Shakespeare is essentially prevented or disabled because of the medium we're using. If we're going to use printed books, it's going to identify some kids as poor at getting to Shakespeare. It would be different for different kinds of kids, but dyslexia as being a good example. So some of you may know, maybe all of you know, that in recent national laws and clinical work, we have begun to change from seeing kids who have things like dyslexia as having learning disabilities to seeing them as having print disabilities, meaning that it's an interaction between the individual and the medium. And print is a very unforgiving medium. There's only one way to do it. You have to decode inside your head. But what's incorrect is to call those kids learning disabled, because they actually often are very good learners if you use a different medium. So we've been incorrectly labeling them and saying, interpreting them instead as having print disabilities co-locates the problem. It says, maybe we shouldn't be using print here because it's going to limit the number of kids that can get to Shakespeare. And there's, I think many of you have heard of the NIMUS laws, which say that schools can no longer provide Shakespeare in only books because it is, in fact, raises barriers for some kids, makes it so they don't have equal opportunities to be educated, and so on. So you can't any longer just use print in U.S. schools. You must provide for kids who need it alternate versions, many of which are digital, which is cool. So that knowledge of knowing that kids are different is not useful unless we have alternatives. And did I click the wrong thing? Oh, yeah. And those alternatives are indeed provided by the new technologies. Print is a really ancient technology, has all kinds of problems in meeting the variability of our students. But new technologies are much more flexible, allow us more options to provide for students. I think this audience I'm talking to doesn't need me to go through this, but you know that if I've got the information in a digital fashion, I can display it on many different kinds of devices, and but I can display it in many different kinds of ways visually. I can display it as either things you look at or things you touch. There's now digital brailling devices, for example, so that I can either look at this text, the information in the text, or I can touch it. And as everybody knows who has a cell phone, I can take that same text and I can put it out not just as visual text, but as auditory text. Text-to-speech means everything now has another root. And I can even take that same text and put it out as sign language. So there's now many options if we have things well designed in a digital world, and that's why we now think of print disability as, wow, print is quite a disabled medium because it can't do that. So digital media have this enormous capacity as long as we take advantage of it. And now I'm going to shift to Mindy, who will talk about some more specific things and resources.
Yeah, so thanks, David. So with all of that great information that David just went over, it's always important to try to, we always get asked, well, how do I actually put this into practice? What are some tools that I can use or some advice that you can give to help me put this into practice in my learning environment? And I have 4 resources, and they're all digital, that I'd like to share with you. One is, it's a blog post by on the ISTE Connect blog. So ISTE is the International Society for Technology and Education. And Rhiannon Gutierrez, who actually used to be an intern and a contractor here at CAST, did a great Ignite talk at the ISTE conference last year, and they created a blog post about it. And it's basically 5 tips to make your digital learning more accessible. So 5 things to keep in mind. So that's great. Also, Kimberly Coy presented at CEC last year. Thank you, Natalie, for posting that in the chat room. And actually, Kimberly Coy is here, so she can probably speak about this better than I can. But she did a great presentation on how to implement UDL in synchronous online environments for K-8. And she created a s'more that I'll show you that's really fantastic. Also, Karen Janowski and Joyce Valenza. Karen Janowski is an AT specialist, and Joyce Valenza is a media specialist. And they came up with this UDL Tech Toolkit. It's a wiki, but it's great. It's really organized in a fantastic way where you can find different tools for different purposes. And that's another resource I'll show. And then also, CAPS Professional Learning has a UDL Tips Series that you can print out the tips or you can use them digitally. We have both options, but they're just a nice way to summarize some tips for a particular, thinking about UDL in your learning environments. Yeah, so those are great. So let me just go through those really quickly. This is Rhiannon's 5 tips for making your digital learning more accessible. So writing alt text for your images, captioning your videos or making sure that the videos you use are captioned, transcribing your podcasts. So if you use podcasts in your classes or if you use them on your blog, I know a lot of bloggers now and people who create podcasts, like for example, Cool Cat Teacher, who's great. I don't know if you follow her, but she's fantastic. Just Google search Cool Cat Teacher, and she's got a great podcast. She has a transcript of all of her podcasts on her website, which is a fantastic practice. Also, structuring your website. So if you have a class website for ADA compliance, and there's a link to the guidelines for how to do that right in the blog post. And then using the right tools. So again, like David was saying, you've got to think about the context. You've got to think about your instructional goal and making sure that you're thinking about your instructional goal when you choose your tools, when you modify your learning environment or are designing for your learning environment. Always using the right tools is really important. So this is Kimberly, a little snippet from Kimberly Coy's UDL and Synchronous Environments, mostly focused on K through 8, but can certainly be used for any number of age level that you're working with. One thing that I wanted to point out in Kimberly's s'more is that if you notice, she has 3 images there, and she has the questions that she talked about during her presentation, the 3 main ideas, but you notice she also describes each image underneath it. One of the problems with SMORE is that it doesn't allow for alt text for images. So what Kimberly did to increase the accessibility of her SMORE so that more people could be able to access that information that's in the image is she describes each image right below it, which is a great practice. So if somebody can't access the image due to a visual disability or due to the fact that they're, they don't have a they don't have a strong internet connection, so the pictures aren't downloading fast enough for them to be able to use them. That's, it's not a disability, but it prevents people from seeing your images. So having that text description offers people an alternative. So that's a really great resource, not only for the ideas that are in it, but because of the example that Kimberly gives of adding those image descriptions right in her resource. So that's fantastic. She also has a glossary right at the top, which is also another great way to increase one of the things that we think of in UDL when we're thinking about options for comprehension. So this is the CAST UDL Tips Series. We have 5 of them right now, where I'm actually working on a 6th one that will be coming out very soon. But we have UDL Tips for developing learning goals, so how to think about universal design for learning when you're developing your learning goals. Tips for assessment, so if you're developing assessments for your classroom or your online environment or your blended learning. Also tips for designing an engaging learning environment, so focusing on engagement. So thinking about the learning environment itself, and it includes tips for brick and mortar learning environments, but also informal learning environments and digital learning environments. So you can think about them all. And tips for reducing stereotype threat, which is has to do with engagement, and they're actually really simple, easy things that you can do to reduce stereotype threat for your students and make a huge difference. And also just the top 5 UDL tips for learning environments. That has a lot to do with accessibility, so I'd also recommend checking that out. And then the last resource is, again, that Karen Janowski and Joyce Valenza's UDL Tech Toolkit. It's a wiki, and they actually created they created the wiki using a thing link. And if you're not familiar with that, it's very cool. You can actually hover over each one of those tape strips that has the words on them, so graphic organizers, literacy tools, study skills tools. And you can click on them and actually get to a whole list of resources, an annotated list of resources, which is fantastic. Talking about different tools, free tools, for-pay tools. She talks about the accessibility of each of those tools sometimes in there, so because she's very focused on accessibility as an AT specialist. It's just a fantastic resource if you're doing an activity in your learning environment, you need a writing tool, or you need some options for writing tools for your students to use. You just click on the writing tools, and there's a whole list of them that you can go through. And like I said, some of them are for free, some of them you can pay for. Some of them are apps for your phone, some of them are apps for tablets. So just a really great resource for thinking when you have your instructional goal in mind and you need some tools that might give your learners some options. But I'm not sure how often those tools are updated, but pretty regularly. It's a wiki, so you can always tell the last time the pages are updated. And Karen Janowski is on Twitter. I believe her handle is @KarenJan, and you can always ask her if the graphic organizer section has been updated recently or not. But those are some great resources that you can. I always like to teach people to fish rather than to give them the tools themselves. I'll put the Twitter ID in the chat. I believe that is her Twitter handle there. And Joyce Valenza is also on Twitter. You just have to search for it. I can't remember it off the top of my head, sorry. But also, when you're thinking about your learning environments and adding UDL to your learning environments, there's some key questions. And I took this from the CAST book, Universal Design for Learning Theory and Practice, which is available online for free. Let me just put the link to that in the chat box. So you can access that there. But these questions go with the guidelines. So basically, when you're thinking about engagement, think about how your learners will engage with the lesson. Does the lesson provide options that can help all learners regulate their own learning? Does it offer options that can help all learners sustain effort and motivation? Does it provide options that engage and interest all learners? And again, if you're choosing a tool, or if you're choosing an LMS, if you're choosing, your next online learning adventure, just substitute that lesson word for whatever you're trying to think about that's new that you're bringing into that you're designing into your environment. And then thinking about representation, thinking about how represented information is presented to the learners. So does it provide options that all learners can reach higher levels of comprehension and understanding? Does it provide options that help all learners understand the symbols and expressions, like Kimberly provided with the glossary at the top of the page? Does the information provide options that help all learners perceive what needs to be learned? So can every learner access it, like the image descriptions that Ree and Kimberly both mentioned? And then thinking about action and expression, how learners are expected to act strategically and express themselves. So does it provide options that help all students act strategically? Does it provide options that help all learners express themselves fluently? Does it provide options that help all learners physically respond? So really thinking about the variability of the learners that you have, but also thinking about the range of variability that exists within each of these parts of the brain and these networks in the brain, and the guidelines themselves is a great way to just, kind of check yourself and make sure that you're thinking about UDL as you're making choices and the decisions that you make in your learning environment. I'll turn it right back over to David.
So just what should I say, finish up the argument earlier, books provide no support, no accessibility to lots of students, and but digitally designed books can do that, and there's dozens of ways, but I just highlighted a couple here. To reduce the barriers to information in text. In a digital environment, there are alternatives for decoding. And now the word that people are using is audio-assisted reading. So you can easily get support for your decoding skills, which is an area, of course, that kids with dyslexia have trouble with, because we have text-to-speech either built in or easily acquired for almost anything digitally now, a fabulous advance. But you can build in, as Mindy was saying, you can build in alternatives, just a simple making a link for vocabulary words directly in the text. We like to joke that we've never seen a natural instant of a child looking up a word in a dictionary that's having trouble reading. But they do click on when you just have a highlighted word that has a link, especially if the link has images and things. We can easily build in that to the digital learning environment so that vocabulary is not a barrier. And that holds for kids with disabilities, but also kids who are English language learners, kids who come from different cultures, so on. And another aspect on comprehension, for example, more detailed than I want to go into right here, but it's easy enough in a well-designed digital environment to provide alternatives for background knowledge, just like for vocabulary. But for the people who don't know what the Civil War is or don't know what quarks are, it's easy enough to provide background knowledge that's easily accessible, clickable, and so on, so that we can, in fact, make sure that people are getting to high levels of comprehension in whatever subject we're teaching. In fact, it's worth saying that that's the goal of UDL, is to get to, I didn't do that well, Mindy, I forgot, the top row of the chart, where we want kids who are good at executive function, even if they're using various assists, who are good at self-regulating, and who are good at complex comprehension. And we don't want to, in UDL, the tendency is not to dumb down, to make things easier, but to support up or smarten up the technology so that more kids are at advanced levels, rather than typically what we do in schools is to reduce the levels of learning and complexity and so on to make it easier, which isn't a good approach in education for lots of reasons. One of them, which is that it makes kids less motivated to keep learning. So in a UDL universe, just to take the representational thing, that there are many options we can quickly build in so that we get to this top line of the hierarchy, options for comprehension. We have kids that are comprehending across media and getting the supports they need when they do that. So if the medium's a video, captioning allows kids to get to it who wouldn't be able to otherwise. If it's in a text format, then text-to-speech allows kids to get to comprehension in a different way. Multiple paths to Shakespeare all can be built in. And now, Mindy and I thought we'd talk a little bit about sort of what's at the forefront of our work right now.
Yeah, it's absolutely okay. We're wondering if there are any questions, though, that you have about that general overview of Universal Design for Learning. Feel free to put them in the chat, or if Natalie or Ashley, if you noticed any that you'd like us to answer now, we can pause for a moment and let people digest a little bit.
And just to foreshadow where we're going, that we're going to go more deeply into emotional design. How do you design for engagement, and particularly looking at some thoughts about high-tech environments. All right, so.
I'll keep an eye on the chat. If there are any questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat and we will pause and answer those.
This is a good example of the challenge of designing for engagement when we can't see you and we're not getting any feedback. It's very hard to be engaging. But there was a question here we should address.
Yes.
The question, do you find conversations about learning styles to be of use in work these days? You might have noticed that I have never used the term, nor Mindy has, learning styles. I think a lot of you probably know that the research has not been, what's the word, not supportive of the use of the typical concepts of learning styles. So in UDL, we don't actually talk about learning styles because it confuses and looks like it connects to that literature. So we studiously avoid it. It doesn't mean that people are all the same. People are really different in the ways in which they learn. But the learning style literature is, what should I say, too loose in its ideas about what might constitute a learning style, and does some learning styles that are, for which there's no evidence whatsoever. So we don't talk about learning styles. Yeah. But we talk about kids for whom text has really got a lot of barriers in it, kids for whom English language has a lot of barriers in it, kids for whom video does not work unless you describe or caption it, and so on. All of those are barriers to learning, and that's what we go after. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead to talk a little bit about emotional design. So we're in that first principle about provide multiple means of engagement. But a lot of our work at CAST recently has been in the emotional design field, because, perhaps mainly because we find that even if you remove barriers for lots of students, barriers including boredom, by the way, that students still face highly problematic learning situations because they've often lost their motivation for what's happening in school. And that the core thing of any learning environment is that the kids are emotionally invested in the learning itself, or in what the teacher is doing, or what their peers are doing, and so on. And without that emotional investment, we don't have learning. And so it doesn't matter that you've captioned your videos. If the kids are not engaged in that video, they're not motivated to watch it, they're only doing it because they're told to. And similarly with digital books that have vocabulary embedded, if kids don't care about it, they don't click on the vocabulary help. They just don't do it. And so our work has been largely now, how do we work on the emotional design, getting kids in ways in which they're highly motivated to learn, even if they've had a bad history. So a lot of the kids we work with had a bad history. Schooling hasn't worked for them because it's been too narrow. It's been many barriers in it. So we now we do think that you first work on the emotional design. How do we make sure that this is worth learning for kids and that they feel good about themselves as learners? If you don't feel good about yourself as a learner, it doesn't matter what kind of access things we do. And if you don't care about it, it doesn't matter whether we caption the videos or not. So engagement has become our sort of number one thing to worry about, and a lot of our work is focused there. And the end of our kind of conversations about this is that we state now that teaching is emotional work. And in longer versions, I talk about, I can do it here without showing the films, but I think all of you know that if you think about any movie about teaching, Good Will Hunting, what's some others, Mindy? That's the trouble.
Mr. Holland, or
yeah.
Holland's Opus?
Yes,
yeah.
Mr. Holland's Opus, the ones about the great debaters. There's a million Hollywood movies about exemplary teaching, but they're never about the discovery of a new way to teach long division. They're always about the ways in which teachers motivate their students. If you think about any of the ones you've seen, they're really about the emotional work of teaching, that a teacher has been able to grab their kids in a new way, and the kids become invested in learning, and then they learn. So we argue strongly that teaching has been thought of as cognitive work, and that definitely comes second. But the first thing you do when you teach is you do emotional work. And you can tell that in the anatomy of the nervous system, that the emotional parts of the brain are at the very center of the brain. And these used to be called the limbic system, but they're the parts of the brain that evaluate and set priorities for what you should attend to, what you should act on, and what you should learn. And good teachers get to this priority-setting area of the brain. That's where the engine of learning really happens. The rest of the cognitive stuff follows that. So you can see it in the brain. And I'm going to make we only have 7 or so minutes, so I'm going to do a little bit of real quick, but there's 2 kinds of ways in which kids get engaged in things like learning. And they can be, although Kahneman doesn't talk about them, that very popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow, does in fact separate out the ways in which the brain works in the ways that I'm going to talk about it, but lots of neuroscience people are interested in this way of thinking. So a way to think about engagement is that there's really 2 kinds of control systems. One, on the left, is the part of your brain that recruits your attention and indeed your effort. And it's fairly automatic, it's often unconscious, you don't know what drew your attention, it's rapid, it's a large capacity, so on. So that's the little, when you're walking down a trail and there's a little rattle sound off to your right, your attention is riveted, or actually not riveted, thrown over there to see, is there a snake there, is there something bad there, whatever. And that automatic nervous system has been donated by evolution to you to make sure that you don't get killed by things that you're not paying attention to. So it's highly motivated to make you pay attention to the most important thing in your environment right now. And you don't get to control it consciously very much because you rely on your nervous system being really good at knowing that in this particular area, there are dangerous rattlesnakes. And in that, once your nervous system knows that, then every time you hear a little rattle, your nervous system says, that's important. I don't care what you're thinking about. I don't care if you're hungry. The most important thing right now is to know what made that rattle. So that's the automatic system. The other system is the executive systems. If the first one is bottom up, your nervous system takes care of it in this automatic way. The second one is much more executive. where, in fact, it's conscious, it's strategic, it's much slower. That's why when you hear that rattle, you jump, your body goes into all kinds of protective reactions. But in fact, you don't even realize it's a snake or think about it for, you know, a full 3/4 or second or two before you're conscious of what nerve made you jump. So the executive system is very different in that it prepares you for things ahead, and you invest attention and effort. When someone says to you, might be a snake on this path, you consciously start looking for snakes. You're not going to be surprised and, you know, hit at the last second, but and you might not even take that path. You might say, you know what, I don't want to take that path then. That's strategic. Slow, you have to think about it, and so on. It's deliberate, all of those words. Okay, those are the two main systems. Well, and they operate together. But I wanted to just, because I knew there'd be some people in this audience that are interested in technology design, and so I wanted to talk for a moment about some simple things that I think people could get a lot more leverage out of measuring. And I'm going to skip these, too much text for us to deal with. But the most interesting ones are the ones where how do you measure whether a kid has engaged in this executive way? I've skipped over the words. They're not reacting, but they're investing. They're saying, because I am worried about there might be a snake on this, I'm going to invest my attention in looking for it, or I'm going to do things strategically like not take that path. Those are executive things. So how do we measure that? I just want to highlight, I know I've only got 2 minutes or so, I want to give some examples of how do you measure when the kid is investing if you're using let's say, a online learning platform. How do we know that the kids are really invested as opposed to they don't care about this, they're only doing automatic things and they're just trying to get out of here? So these are a few things that are fairly easy to measure and that are good signs that a kid is invested. I want to highlight just two. One is measuring help seeking. Providing help buttons, providing alternative ways that kids could get more help is a good thing to do. But one of the best things about it is you can see if the kids actually seek help. Most kids who are in trouble as learners don't seek help. And what you want to do as good teachers is to help them get so that they seek help when they need it. And most kids, again, don't seek help. And we've been doing some research here to look at how do we help kids not avoid, as they typically do, help, but actually seek out. So one of them is to make sure you embed lots of help opportunities, make them clear to students, and measure. Are they seeking help? Just, in fact, clicking on a vocabulary word is help seeking. Looking for more background information is help seeking. Are they doing that is an easy thing to measure, and it's an indicant of the fact that they are investing because they're spending more time. And here's some examples. Do you use hints? Do you click on a model? Do you use the scaffolds? Do you use feedback? Any of those are good examples of a kid who is actually investing. That is, they're putting extra time to look at a hint or a model or whatever. And that's an investment in their future, in their learning. So those are good things to measure. And you can get more subtle about it when you look just at feedback. Did they seek it? Did they attend to it? Did they respond to feedback? Did they revise after feedback? All of those are great investment measures. One last thing and we'll be done. Whoops, I skipped the part I wanted. Perhaps, well, in view of time, the last one here is you're measuring whether kids revise anything. Do they regress? Do they look back? Having read a part that they don't understand, do they go back and read it again? Recursions in text-to-speech, you can see, do they go back to have a text read to them aloud? All of them. So sort of a long list that we've been developing of ways in which we can automate some good measures of this executive investing kind of attention. We think they're going to become more prominent in the years ahead. So Mindy, I'll let you finish us out.
Yeah, so we really appreciate the invitation for being here. I noticed one question that I just wanted to answer briefly. We do have a website for UDL in higher education, and I'm going to put that link in the chat box. It's called UDL on Campus. And you can find out more about how UDL differs or is the same. Mostly it's the same in higher education, but just thinking specifically about how UDL can be used in higher education and adult learning. And it's 3 o'clock, and Natalie and Ashley, thank you so much for having David and I here today. We really appreciate the opportunity.
Wow, thank you both so much. That was the quickest hour. Yeah, I mean, thank you guys so much for all of your work, from the learning sciences research to the tools you shared to some of the new work you're doing on emotional teaching. That was just fabulous. So as a reminder for our attendees, we will send you an email including the link to the full recording, and you'll be able to download the slides as well. So look for that email and you can revisit this entire conversation. Again, thank you, David and Mindy. That was a fantastic presentation. We're grateful for the work you are doing. And we encourage you guys to attend future webinars. We have 2 webinars a month, and they're usually up on our website about 3 weeks in advance. So thank you very much, and we will see you all next time.